I am Gemma, 33 years old, and a cyber intelligence officer serving in the United States military. I came home from my base with my 1-year-old son, Leo, smiling the entire way because my husband, Brandon, had texted me to not be late for a special surprise his mother had waiting for me. But the moment I walked in the living room was filled with his glaring relatives. Brandon slammed a piece of paper on the coffee table and announced to the room that a DNA test proved Leo was not his child. My mother-in-law, Diane, pointed a shaking finger at the door and screamed at me to get out of her house. Before I could even say a word, the doorbell rang. If you have ever been ambushed by the people who promised to love you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the best revenge is staying perfectly calm while your enemies destroy themselves. The drive from the military base to my suburban home had been completely ordinary. I was exhausted from a grueling week of analyzing encrypted data streams and running cybersecurity protocols, but the thought of a family surprise had kept my spirits high. Brandon and I had been married for 4 years, and while our relationship had felt strained recently due to his mounting credit card debt and secretive behavior, I genuinely thought this gathering was his way of making amends. I balanced Leo on my hip, my heavy uniform boots thudding against the hardwood floor as I pushed the front door open. The silence in the living room was deafening. It was not the joyful silence of a surprise party. It was the suffocating silence of an execution squad waiting for the prisoner. Diane was standing by the fireplace with her arms crossed, her face twisted in a look of absolute disgust. Brandon stood in the center of the room, flanked by his cousins and aunts, looking incredibly smug. I did not even have the chance to set my bag down before Brandon threw a stapled document onto the glass coffee table. He looked at me with cold eyes and declared that he knew everything. He told the entire room of staring relatives that the DNA test on the table was absolute proof that Leo was the product of an affair. He called me a liar and a disgrace to my uniform. Diane immediately stepped forward, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls, screaming that I was an adulterous woman who had trapped her precious son. She ordered me to pack a single bag, leave the baby she claimed was a stranger to their bloodline, and get out of her house immediately. I stood there absorbing the sheer hostility radiating from the people I had supported for years. My military training had taught me how to compartmentalize panic and assess threats under extreme pressure. I did not cry. I did not drop to my knees and beg them to believe me. I simply held my son tighter and observed the scene. I was about to ask Brandon what kind of absurd delusion he was trying to sell to his family when the doorbell rang, cutting through Diane's hysterical screaming. Brandon flinched. The smug confidence on his face vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by pure panic. He rushed toward the foyer, insisting he would handle whoever was at the door and that I needed to be gone by the time he returned. But I was faster. I stepped past him and pulled the front door open myself. A man in a sharp polo shirt stood on the porch holding a clipboard and a laser measuring device. He smiled politely, totally unaware of the domestic war zone he had just stepped into. He introduced himself as the real estate appraiser Brandon had hired to evaluate the property for an expedited listing. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with crystal clarity. This was not about infidelity. This was about money. I turned slowly to look at my husband. Brandon had been drowning in debt for months, secretly draining our joint savings to fund a lifestyle he could not afford while I was deployed or working long hours at the base. Now he was trying to blindside me with a fake scandal, kick me out in a state of emotional shock, and immediately sell the house from under me. I walked calmly back to the coffee table and picked up the so-called DNA test. The relatives watched me with bated breath, expecting me to break down in tears. Instead, I scanned the document with the trained eye of a cyber intelligence officer. I looked at the letterhead, the formatting, and the signature at the bottom. A cold, hard smile touched my lips. I looked directly at Brandon and asked him how much he had paid for this incredibly amateur forgery. Diane gasped, calling me delusional and demanding I stop lying. I ignored her completely. I pointed to the logo at the top of the page and informed the room that the clinic listed on this official document was a fraudulent shell company. I knew this for a fact because my intelligence unit had intercepted their encrypted servers just last week, assisting federal agents in shutting them down for manufacturing fake medical records, passports, and identity documents for identity thieves. I tossed the paper back onto the table. I told Brandon that he was remarkably stupid to use a website that was currently sitting in an FBI evidence file to fake a paternity test against an active duty intelligence officer. The color drained from Brandon's face. He stammered, looking around at his relatives who were suddenly whispering among themselves. Realizing his narrative was falling apart, he pivoted to aggression. He puffed out his chest and marched toward me, accusing me of using my military clearance to intimidate him. He yelled that I was trying to confuse his family with technical jargon because I was guilty. He demanded the keys to the house, claiming that as my husband, he had the right to liquidate marital assets to cover the debts I had allegedly forced him into. Diane, ever the enabler of her son's toxic behavior, pulled out her phone. She shrieked that she was not going to let a cheating, manipulative woman steal her son's home. She dialed 911 right there in the living room, telling the dispatcher that a hostile individual was trespassing on her son's property and refusing to leave. I did not try to stop her. I calmly bounced Leo on my hip, making sure he was comfortable, and waited. The relatives began moving toward the edges of the room, sensing that the dynamic had drastically shifted. Brandon paced back and forth, muttering under his breath about how the police would force me out and hand him full control of the property. He genuinely believed his own lies. He thought that because he was a man in his own home making loud accusations, the authorities would automatically side with him. Within 10 minutes, 2 police officers arrived at the front door. Diane rushed to meet them, launching into a hysterical performance about how I was a dangerous, cheating wife who was threatening her son and refusing to vacate the premises. Brandon stood tall, trying to look like the wounded patriarch, and told the officers he needed me removed immediately so he could secure his property. The older of the 2 officers approached me, asking for my identification and inquiring if I lived at the residence. I did not argue or raise my voice. I reached into my uniform pocket and handed him my military ID. Then I pulled up a digital copy of the house deed on my secure phone and handed it to him. I informed the officers that this house was purchased entirely with my funds before I ever met Brandon, and my name was the only one on the deed. I then looked directly at Brandon and cited the Service Members Civil Relief Act. I explained to the officers and the completely silent room of relatives that under federal law, it is strictly illegal to evict, remove, or alter the residential status of an active duty military member from their primary legal residence without a direct court order. I added that my husband had just attempted to use forged medical documents to illegally extort my property and had invited a real estate appraiser here to illegally sell a home he did not own. The police officers reviewed my identification and the deed. Their demeanor instantly shifted. The older officer turned to Brandon, handing my phone back to me, and stated clearly that this was my legal residence. He informed Brandon that not only could they not remove me, but if Brandon or anyone in this room continued to harass, threaten, or attempt to illegally evict a military officer from her own home, they would all be arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace. The silence that followed was absolute. The aunts and cousins who had been sneering at me just 30 minutes ago suddenly grabbed their coats and purses, rushing toward the door without making eye contact. Diane tried to argue with the police, demanding they look at the DNA test, but the officer firmly told her to step outside before she was placed in handcuffs. Brandon stood frozen as his grand master plan collapsed around him. His family abandoned him, fleeing the house to avoid legal trouble. The police escorted Diane out to the driveway. Brandon knew he had lost this battle. He grabbed his coat, his face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. As he walked past me toward the door, he stopped and lowered his voice so the police outside could not hear. He told me I could keep the house for now, but he was going to destroy me in court. He promised to take full custody of Leo and force me to pay him alimony for the rest of my life. He smiled maliciously, stating that the courts would never favor an absentee military mother over a stable father, and he would make sure everyone believed his version of the truth. He walked out the door, leaving me alone in the house I had paid for holding the son he had just tried to disown. I secured the deadbolt and engaged the perimeter alarm system before carrying Leo upstairs to his nursery. The house was quiet now, stripped of the chaotic screaming and the venomous presence of my in-laws. I laid my son in his crib and watched his chest rise and fall with steady, peaceful breaths. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his father had just tried to erase him from his life. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury I could not afford. My training kicked in, overriding the emotional shock with cold, calculated pragmatism. Brandon had declared war, and in any war the first step to victory is gathering actionable intelligence. I walked down the hall to the home office. Brandon spent hours in this room, always closing the door and claiming he was working on complex financial portfolios to secure our future. I booted up my encrypted laptop and connected it to our home network. Brandon had always insisted on managing our joint finances. He framed it as his way of supporting our marriage, while I handled the intense demands of my military deployments. I had trusted him to handle the mundane tasks of paying bills and managing our savings. That trust had been a critical tactical error. I logged into our primary banking portal. At first glance, the checking account looked normal, holding enough funds to cover the upcoming mortgage payment. But I was not looking at the surface. I dug into the transaction history, downloading the raw data files for the past 12 months. I ran a quick script to categorize the expenditures. The pattern emerged almost instantly. There were consistent, unexplained withdrawals in amounts just under the threshold that would typically trigger a fraud alert. These funds were being funneled into a secondary account I had never seen before. My heart rate remained steady as I dug deeper. I navigated to the high-yield savings account I had established the week Leo was born. I had been depositing a substantial portion of my hazard pay and bonuses directly into that account, strictly designated as his future college fund. I typed in my credentials and waited for the dashboard to load. The balance displayed on the screen was a single digit, 0. I stared at the screen, the glowing white light reflecting in my eyes. The college fund was completely drained. A series of rapid wire transfers executed over the last 90 days had bled the account dry. Brandon had not just lied about a DNA test. He had financially cannibalized his own child. I cracked my knuckles and shifted my focus to Brandon's desktop computer sitting on the opposite side of the office. He had left it powered down. I booted it up and encountered his password screen. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass his rudimentary administrative security and gain root access to his hard drive. He thought he was clever. He had cleared his browser history, emptied his digital trash bin, and deleted all recent email correspondence. To an average person, the machine looked clean. To a cyber intelligence officer, a wiped drive is the digital equivalent of a smoking gun. I launched a data recovery protocol, extracting cached files, fragmented documents, and deleted correspondence straight from the physical drive. The progress bar crept across my screen, unearthing a mountain of secrets he thought he had buried permanently. The missing money had not gone toward household upgrades or secret investments in blue-chip stocks. I traced the routing numbers from the wire transfers. Brandon had funneled Leo's college fund along with tens of thousands of dollars from our joint savings through a maze of digital wallets. He utilized tumbling services in a pathetic attempt to obscure the money trail, but his operational security was laughable. I tracked the digital footprints directly to a highly volatile offshore cryptocurrency exchange. I opened a recovered spreadsheet he had tried to destroy. It laid out his crypto portfolio in agonizing detail. Brandon had fancied himself a day-trading genius. He had leveraged our cash to buy high-risk digital assets on margin betting everything on a market surge that never happened. The market had crashed hard a few months ago. His portfolio was decimated, he had lost everything. But the catastrophic crypto losses were only the tip of the iceberg. I pulled a comprehensive credit report under his social security number. The document that generated was staggering. Brandon was drowning in a sea of debt. He had maxed out 6 different credit cards, all hidden from me, through electronic statements sent to a secure email address I never knew existed. Worse, he had taken out multiple personal loans with predatory interest rates, to cover his initial market losses, hoping to win the money back before I ever noticed it was missing. The total amount he owed was well over $200,000. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark room. The puzzle pieces snapped together, forming a horrifyingly clear picture of his grand strategy. This explosive confrontation tonight was never about a sudden crisis of faith in our marriage or a sudden doubt about Leo's paternity. Brandon did not actually believe I had cheated on him. He knew Leo was his son. The fake DNA test was a calculated predatory exit strategy. If Brandon filed for a standard, no-fault divorce in our state, the courts would divide our marital assets and our marital debts evenly. He would be forced to disclose his catastrophic financial ruin, and he would carry half of that massive debt burden into his new life. He would be utterly destroyed. He needed a way out that left him with cash and left me holding the bag. He needed an at-fault divorce. If he could successfully frame me as an adulterous wife who had deceived him about the paternity of our child, he could manipulate the entire legal narrative. He wanted to paint himself as the devastated, betrayed husband. But his plan was far more malicious than just winning a favorable settlement in family court. He intended to weaponize my military career against me. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, adultery is not just a moral failing. It is a severe offense that can trigger a court-martial. Brandon knew this perfectly well. He planned to take his fabricated DNA test directly to my commanding officers. He wanted to spark a formal military investigation, dragging my name through the mud and destroying my security clearance. A guilty finding would mean a dishonorable discharge. I would lose my rank, my steady military income, my pension, and my reputation. With my career obliterated and my character assassinated in both military and civilian courts, Brandon planned to swoop in for the kill. He would use my disgraced status to claim full sole custody of Leo, arguing that a dishonorably discharged adulterous mother was unfit to raise a child. Once he had full custody, he would demand maximum child support and spousal alimony. He intended to enslave me financially. He wanted to force me to spend the rest of my life working to pay him monthly support checks, which he would then use to quietly pay off his massive crypto debts and fund his lifestyle. He thought he had engineered the perfect crime. He thought he could ambush me with a fake document, utilize his mother's screaming theatrics to break me emotionally, kick me out of my own home, and set the legal machinery in motion before I could even catch my breath. He assumed I would panic. He assumed I would be too busy defending my honor to look at the bank accounts. I closed the spreadsheets and began quietly exporting all the recovered files, bank statements, and credit reports onto a secure encrypted flash drive. I was no longer just a wife going through a messy breakup. I was an intelligence officer gathering ammunition against a hostile threat. Brandon had made a fatal miscalculation. He had mistaken my silence in the living room for weakness. He had mistaken my long hours at the base for ignorance. He had poked a sleeping bear, and now he was going to face the full force of my retaliation. I systematically logged out of all his accounts and scrubbed my own digital footprints from his machine, leaving it exactly as I had found it. Let him think his secrets were still safe. Let him think he still held the upper hand. I unplugged my flash drive and slipped it into my pocket. The cold metal against my palm was the most comforting thing I had felt all day. I walked back into the nursery and looked at Leo, sleeping soundly. Brandon wanted to use my son as a pawn to pay off his gambling debts. I swore right then, watching my baby sleep, that Brandon would never see a single dime of my money, and he would never lay a hand on Leo again. I was going to dismantle his life piece by piece, document by document, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The next morning arrived with a biting chill that perfectly matched my state of mind. I dressed in my uniform, my movements precise and mechanical. I dropped Leo off at the Base Child Development Center, kissing his warm forehead and promising him a good day while ignoring the heavy knot forming in my stomach. As I walked into the Cyber Intelligence Command Center, the atmosphere felt distinctly hostile. The usual morning chatter among the analysts was non-existent. Eyes darted away as I walked down the sterile corridor, and conversations died abruptly as I passed. My security badge buzzed me through the reinforced doors, but before I could even reach my workstation, my commanding officer's adjutant stepped directly into my path. He did not offer a morning greeting. He simply informed me that Major Davis required my presence in the main briefing room immediately. It was not a request, it was a direct order. I walked into the briefing room to find Major Davis sitting at the head of the long metal table. Beside him sat a stony-faced officer from the Judge Advocate General Corps. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, sealing the room in total silence. Major Davis did not offer me a seat. He simply slid a thick manila folder across the cold table toward me. His voice was completely devoid of emotion as he informed me that the command had received a formal communication from my husband early this morning. I opened the folder. Sitting right on top was a printed copy of the exact same fabricated DNA test Brandon had slammed onto our coffee table the night before. Attached to it was a highly detailed, venomously written letter. Brandon had officially accused me of carrying on a long-term affair with an unnamed civilian. He claimed he had just discovered the infidelity and had run a paternity test proving I had deceived him into raising another man's child. He concluded his letter by demanding the military take immediate disciplinary action against me for destroying his family and violating the moral standards required of an officer. Major Davis looked me dead in the eye and stated the reality of my situation. Under Article 134 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, adultery is a criminal offense. Because my position required a top-secret security clearance and involved highly sensitive national security data, any behavior that compromised my integrity, exposed me to blackmail, or prejudiced good order and discipline was considered a direct threat to the United States military. The JAG officer took over, outlining the catastrophic potential consequences. If the allegations were substantiated, I would face a court-martial. The maximum penalty included a dishonorable discharge, total forfeiture of all military pay and allowances, and confinement in a military prison. My 10 years of flawless service, my commendations, my pension, and my entire professional identity were currently teetering on the edge of total annihilation. Brandon knew exactly what he was doing. He had bypassed family court entirely for his opening strike and went straight for the nuclear option. By reporting me to my command, he intended to paralyze me completely. A formal military investigation would immediately suspend my security clearance, effectively grounding me and isolating me from my unit. Without my clearance, I could not do my job. Without my job, my income would eventually freeze. He wanted me penniless, disgraced, and fighting for my freedom behind military bars. This would leave him completely unchecked to drain whatever assets remained, sell the house, and seize sole custody of Leo. The walls of the briefing room seemed to close in. The fluorescent lights buzzed harshly overhead. For a fraction of a second, the sheer magnitude of his betrayal threatened to knock the breath out of my lungs. The man I had married, the man who smiled at me over dinner and slept beside me every night, had actively plotted to send me to federal prison. He wanted to strip away my uniform and lock me in a cell, just to cover up his own disastrous financial crimes and crypto gambling losses. But Brandon had made one crucial error. He assumed I would react like a terrified, heartbroken wife caught in a scandal. He forgot that he had married an intelligence officer trained to operate under extreme psychological warfare. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I stood at attention, my posture rigid, my expression completely neutral. I looked Major Davis in the eye and firmly stated that the allegations were entirely false. I informed him that the document inside that folder was a crude, malicious forgery. I requested permission to speak freely, and upon his nod, I dismantled Brandon's entire narrative with surgical precision. I explained that the clinic logo printed on the supposed test results belonged to a fraudulent shell corporation. I reminded Major Davis of the joint task force operation our cyber unit had assisted with just the previous week. I pointed out that the very clinic listed on that paper was currently under federal investigation for manufacturing fraudulent identity and medical documents for cyber criminals. I asked the Major to look closely at the routing numbers and barcodes on the page. explaining how they failed to align with standard medical encryption protocols and pointing out the digital kerning errors in the font that proved the document had been generated by a cheap online template rather than a certified laboratory system. Major Davis frowned, pulling the document closer to examine the inconsistencies I had highlighted. The JAG officer leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the paper. They were trained to look for deception, and I was handing them the exact threads to pull to unravel my husband's lie. I did not stop there. I formally requested an immediate military-supervised DNA test. I told the JAG officer that I wanted my son, my husband, and myself subjected to a legally binding paternity test drawn by military medical personnel at the base hospital today. I stated that I welcomed a full transparent investigation into my conduct, but I also formally requested that the command investigate the fraudulent nature of the document submitted by a civilian dependent. Submitting a forged document to a military command to initiate a false criminal investigation against an active duty service member is a severe federal offense. Brandon thought he was using the military as his personal weapon to execute a flawless divorce strategy. He had no idea he had just walked himself straight into federal jurisdiction and handed the military a reason to investigate him. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The heavy hostility directed at me morphed into a calculating analytical scrutiny directed at the paper on the table. Major Davis closed the folder. He informed me that my security clearance would be temporarily restricted to unclassified duties, pending the preliminary inquiry, which was standard protocol and unavoidable. However, he also authorized my request for a military-supervised DNA test. He instructed the JAG officer to facilitate the medical orders immediately to establish the facts. Before dismissing me, Major Davis gave me a hard, penetrating look. He warned me that if I was lying, the military would prosecute me to the fullest extent of the law, and no amount of technical jargon would save me. I held his gaze without blinking. I replied that I looked forward to the absolute truth coming to light, and I saluted him before turning on my heel. I walked out of the briefing room with my career hanging by a thread, but my mind was operating at 1,000 miles a minute. Brandon had drawn first blood in the legal arena. He had proven that there were no lines he would not cross, and no lies he would not tell. He was willing to destroy my life, my freedom, and my relationship with my son just to save himself from bankruptcy. I walked to my temporary unclassified workstation and sat down. My hands were perfectly steady. The emotional shock had completely burned away, leaving nothing but cold, absolute resolve. Brandon wanted to play a high-stakes legal game involving federal authorities and military justice. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for, but I was going to dictate the rules of engagement. I pulled out my secure phone. The military would handle the fraudulent DNA test and the UCMJ accusations. That front was secure, and I knew the science would clear my name. But defending myself was no longer enough. To truly crush Brandon and protect my son from his toxic manipulation, I needed to launch a massive counteroffensive in the civilian world. I needed an attorney who specialized in tearing manipulative predators apart in family court. I needed someone ruthless, someone who understood how to use financial data as a weapon. It was time to stop playing defense and start setting the trap that would end him. I left my unclassified workstation and walked straight across the base to the Judge Advocate General office. Captain Reed, an experienced military defense attorney, sat across from me and reviewed the details of the temporary suspension of my clearance. He assured me that the upcoming military-supervised DNA test would unequivocally clear me of the adultery charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The science would prove my innocence, and Brandon would face a severe backlash from the federal authorities for submitting a forged document to a military command. However, Captain Reed leaned forward and gave me a harsh reality check. He explained that the military could only protect my career and my freedom. They had absolutely no jurisdiction over my civilian assets, my home, or the custody of my son Leo. To protect my child and my property, I needed a civilian attorney who specialized in high-conflict litigation. I needed a shark. I took his advice. During my lunch break, I secured a meeting with Elias, the most ruthless and feared divorce attorney in the state. Elias ran a boutique law firm in downtown known for completely dismantling manipulative spouses and leaving them with nothing. I sat in his glass-walled conference room, bypassing all the emotional pleasantries, and handed him the encrypted flash drive containing the entirety of Brandon's financial ruin. Elias plugged the drive into his secure terminal and brought his forensic accountant into the room. For the next hour, they reviewed the data I had extracted from Brandon's wiped hard drive. They saw the catastrophic cryptocurrency losses, the completely drained college fund, and the massive web of predatory personal loans. Elias leaned back in his leather chair and smiled a cold, predatory smile. He told me that in his 20 years of practice, he had rarely seen a spouse hand over the rope to hang themselves with such absolute precision. We did not waste a single second. Elias drafted an aggressive ex parte emergency motion and filed it directly with the family court before the courthouse closed for the day. Our first strike was obtaining a civilian court order recognizing the military-supervised DNA test, preserving its chain of custody, and compelling Brandon to participate. This completely neutralized Brandon's fake paperwork in the civilian sector. If Brandon refused to submit to the official court-ordered test, the judge would immediately rule against him. If he complied, his lie would be scientifically exposed on the public record. Simultaneously, Elias filed an emergency financial injunction. The court order instantly froze all of our marital assets. It placed a strict legal block on the deed of my house, making it a federal crime for Brandon or his real estate appraiser to attempt to list, sell, or leverage the property. The injunction also locked down every bank account attached to Brandon's name, preventing him from moving another dime of marital funds or taking out any more secret loans. We trapped him in a financial cage. I spent the next 48 hours operating in a state of hyper-focused calm. I went to my unclassified job at the base, cared for Leo in the evenings, and ignored the barrage of hostile text messages flooding my phone from my mother-in-law, Diane. She was still under the delusion that I was packing my bags and preparing to be dishonorably discharged. I simply blocked her number and waited for Elias to finish analyzing the rest of the digital footprint. 2 days later, Elias called me back to his downtown office. When I walked into the conference room, the atmosphere was distinctly different. The forensic accountant was sitting at the table with a thick stack of printed ledgers, looking incredibly serious. Elias did not smile this time. He gestured for me to sit down and slid a highlighted financial statement across the polished mahogany table. He told me that while my extraction of the cryptocurrency losses was flawless, the forensic team had dug even deeper into the routing numbers attached to Brandon's hidden credit lines. They had found a secondary credit account that Brandon had shielded behind a corporate LLC. It was a masterclass in financial deception, but it unraveled a secondary motive that went far beyond bad stock margins and gambling debts. I looked down at the highlighted lines on the statement. The charges were not for digital assets or loan repayments. They were massive retail transactions at luxury boutiques. I saw a charge for $8,000 at a high-end jewelry store for a diamond tennis bracelet. I saw another transaction for $4,000 at a designer handbag retailer. There were consistent weekly charges of $500 at a premium organic grocery market located in a wealthy district completely across the city, miles away from our suburban home and Brandon's workplace. My eyes scanned the right side of the ledger where the shipping details and billing addresses were listed. None of these luxury items were being shipped to our house. They were all directed to a luxury apartment complex in the city center. Elias slid a second document across the table. It was a copy of a residential lease agreement. The forensic accountant had managed to pull the public utility records for that specific apartment unit. The utility bills were being paid directly out of the same hidden corporate account Brandon used to hide his credit card debt. Furthermore, Brandon was listed as the primary financial guarantor on the lease. I stared at the lease agreement, my analytical mind processing the data with terrifying speed. Brandon was not just running from a mountain of debt. He was actively funding an entirely separate life. The diamond bracelets, the designer bags, the luxury apartment lease, and the premium groceries were not for him. Elias looked at me and stated the undeniable truth. Brandon was projecting his own guilt onto me. He needed the at-fault divorce, he needed my military career destroyed, and he needed full custody of Leo with maximum child support because he was utterly desperate for cash. He needed my money to maintain his secret life. There was another woman. I did not break down. The revelation did not shatter my heart. It only sharpened my focus into a lethal weapon. Brandon had dared to look me in the eye and accuse me of adultery in front of his entire family. He had dared to submit a fake DNA test to the United States military to ruin my life, all while he was using our son's college fund to play sugar daddy to a mistress across town. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket and logged into a basic public records database Elias provided. I typed in the address of the luxury apartment. I cross-referenced the unit number with the building's current tenant registry. The system processed the request for a few seconds before a name populated on the screen. The tenant of record was a woman named Vanessa. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The pieces of the puzzle were finally complete. Brandon thought he was the mastermind of this operation. He thought he could steal my son, steal my home, and use my military service to trap me in a corner. But he had left a trail of digital breadcrumbs leading straight to his mistress, and he had no idea that I now held the keys to his absolute destruction. I left Elias's office and walked straight to my car. The afternoon sun beat down on the pavement, but I felt entirely cold. I did not drive back to the base. I did not drive home to the suburbs. I programmed the GPS with the address I had just pulled from the public registry. I needed a visual confirmation. In intelligence work, data is only half the battle. You always verify the target with your own eyes. The drive to the city's center took 40 minutes. As I crossed into the financial district, the landscape shifted from practical family neighborhoods to towering glass high-rises and exclusive retail blocks. This was a world of valet parking, private concierges, and designer storefronts. It was a world entirely disconnected from the modest, disciplined life I lived as a military officer. I parked my car on the street opposite the luxury apartment complex, adjusting my rearview mirror to give me a clear line of sight to the main entrance. The building was a fortress of modern wealth. Polished marble pillars flanked the revolving glass doors. A uniformed doorman stood at attention, greeting residents who walked dogs that probably cost more than my first vehicle. This was where Brandon's hidden credit lines were bleeding out. He was hemorrhaging cash to maintain a facade of extreme affluence. I sat in my car for over an hour watching the entrance. I had run a background check on Vanessa while sitting in the law office pulling her driver's license photo from the state database. She was 25 years old. She had no significant employment history, no property under her name, and a digital footprint that consisted entirely of curated social media posts showing off luxury vacations and expensive dinners. Then the revolving doors spun, and she stepped out onto the sidewalk. There was no mistaking her. It was the same woman from the database photo, but seeing her in person brought the financial ledgers to life. She was wearing the exact designer handbag I had seen listed on Brandon's hidden credit card statement. A diamond tennis bracelet caught the sunlight on her wrist, a brilliant sparkle that cost $8,000 of marital funds. She looked completely carefree, checking her phone with a manicured hand while she waited for something. I watched her with clinical detachment. She was not the enemy. She was just another variable in Brandon's disastrous equation. But as she turned sideways to wave at an approaching luxury rideshare vehicle, the final devastating piece of the puzzle fell into place. Her fitted cashmere dress hugged her figure tightly, revealing a pronounced undeniable curve. She was heavily pregnant. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. The breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. A mistress was one thing. A mistress carrying his child was an entirely different tactical landscape. I watched the driver open the door for her. She slid into the back seat, completely oblivious to the fact that her luxurious lifestyle was built on a foundation of massive financial fraud and the attempted destruction of another woman's life. The black car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the city traffic. I did not follow her. I had seen exactly what I needed to see. I leaned back against the headrest, and let the silence of my car wash over me. The mathematical reality of Brandon's betrayal clicked into perfect, horrifying alignment. Brandon was not merely hiding an affair, he was financing a second family. Vanessa's pregnancy explained the sudden spike in his spending, the drained college fund, and the urgency behind his attack. His fraudulent DNA test was designed to remove me from the house, destroy my income, and free enough money to preserve the wealthy identity he had sold her. I started the engine of my car. The low rumble of the motor grounded me. Brandon had discarded me because my honest, hard-working life was not glamorous enough for his delusions. He thought my discipline made me boring. He thought my deployments made me an easy target. He assumed I would crumble under the weight of his accusations and the screaming fits of his mother. He was wrong. I pulled away from the curb and merged into the city traffic. Brandon wanted to play the role of a wealthy patriarch, protecting his honor. I was going to let him keep playing that role right up until the moment I dropped the anvil on his head. He had funded his new family by stealing from my son. He had tried to frame me with a federal crime. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Elias. The attorney answered on the first ring. I kept my voice completely level as I reported my findings. I told Elias about the luxury building. I told him about the diamond bracelet and the designer bag. And then I told him about the pregnancy. Elias let out a low whistle over the line. He immediately understood the tactical advantage this gave us. Brandon was perjuring himself by hiding assets, and he was doing it to hide a second family. Elias told me to come back to the office the next morning. We needed to update the court filings and we needed to prepare for the deposition. I drove back to the suburbs with a new sense of purpose. Diane was probably still at home drafting her social media posts playing the victim, rallying the neighborhood against the wicked daughter-in-law. She had no idea that her precious son was siphoning away his future to pay for an apartment downtown. She had no idea that the scandal she was so desperate to broadcast was about to blow up in her own face. I pulled into my driveway. The house was quiet. Leo was safe. My career was currently protected by the JAG office. I walked through the front door knowing exactly what my next move would be. The reconnaissance phase was officially over. It was time to start setting the traps. I was going to let Brandon walk into a sworn deposition, sit under oath, and dig his own grave. And when the time was right, I was going to introduce his mother to the ghost named Vanessa. I woke up the next morning prepared to finalize the deposition strategy with Elias. Instead, the battlefield shifted violently. My phone buzzed with an alert from a junior analyst at the base. She sent a single link with a warning to brace myself. I tapped the screen and found myself staring at a crowdfunding campaign page. The title was plastered in bold letters asking to save a devoted father from a deceitful wife. The campaign was authored by Diane. She had uploaded a heavily filtered photo of Brandon looking suitably miserable, deliberately omitting any pictures of me or the reality of our lives. The description she wrote was a masterclass in creative fiction. Diane claimed her son had just discovered his military wife was a serial adulterer who had trapped him into raising another man's child. She pleaded for public donations, stating Brandon had been unjustly kicked out of his own home by military police and desperately needed financial assistance to hire a top-tier custody lawyer. She claimed he needed to rescue his innocent son from a hostile and morally bankrupt environment. The fundraising goal was set at $50,000. In less than 12 hours, it had already raised over $8,000. I recognized the names of the donors immediately. Aunts, uncles, neighbors, and fellow church members had all opened their wallets to fund Brandon's imaginary legal defense. Diane had always been obsessed with her social standing in the suburban middle-class hierarchy. She treated neighborhood gossip like a competitive sport, and now she was weaponizing her connections to destroy my reputation and line her son's pockets. The digital attack did not stay confined to the internet. Diane had shared the link to our neighborhood community group appending a tearful caption about how her family was broken by a woman who hid behind a military uniform. By the time I carried Leo downstairs for breakfast, my phone was swamped with hateful messages from people I waved to every morning. Women who had smiled at me at the local park were now sending me messages calling me a disgrace. I fed Leo his oatmeal, keeping my demeanor entirely normal for his sake. I refused to let the toxic energy of Brandon's family infiltrate the peace of my morning routine with my son. Once Leo was strapped into his carrier, I grabbed my keys to head to the base child development center. I stepped out the front door and stopped dead in my tracks. My vehicle parked in the driveway had been heavily vandalized. A gallon of bright red paint had been splashed across the windshield, and the driver's side door dripping onto the concrete driveway. The word cheater was scrawled across the hood in jagged, aggressive letters. An average person would have broken down in tears or called Brandon screaming. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. Diane and her flying monkeys thought they were terrorizing me. In reality, they were handing me actionable evidence of harassment and property damage. I did not scream. I did not panic. I pulled out my secure phone and took high-resolution photographs of the vehicle from multiple angles, ensuring the timestamps and geolocation data were embedded in the metadata. I captured the dripping paint, the slurs on the hood, and the footprints left behind on the pavement. I walked calmly back inside and called a trusted colleague from my intelligence unit asking for a ride to the base. I then contacted the local police via the non-emergency line to file a formal report for vandalism. When the responding officer arrived, I did not act like a hysterical victim. I handed him the printed screenshots of Diane's crowdfunding campaign and the vicious neighborhood group posts, establishing a clear, documented link between the online incitement and the physical damage to my property. I made sure a formal police report was generated, logging the estimated cost of the damage and identifying Diane's public smear campaign as the primary catalyst. I walked into the Cyber Intelligence Command Center with my head held high. The whispers that had followed me the previous day were still there, but they did not matter. My focus was absolute. I sat at my unclassified workstation and immediately established a secure connection with Elias. The attorney appeared on my screen looking highly energized. He held up a printed copy of the crowdfunding page I had sent him from the car. He told me that in all his years of practicing law, he had rarely seen someone publicly broadcast their own liability with such reckless enthusiasm. I leaned forward and told Elias that we were not going to post a single public rebuttal. We were not going to engage with the neighborhood gossip or issue a tearful statement defending my honor. Engaging with a smear campaign only validates the attacker and gives them the attention they crave. Instead, I wanted to weaponize their own digital arrogance against them. I instructed Elias to prepare a massive defamation lawsuit, but I wanted it built on airtight, irrefutable data. Elias grinned and explained the legal concept of defamation per se. Because Diane was publicly accusing me of adultery, which is a criminal offense under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, she was not just insulting me, she was accusing a federal officer of a crime. Furthermore, she was claiming I was an unfit mother and a fraud. Because my high-level security clearance and my military career were entirely dependent on my integrity and moral standing, her public accusations were a direct threat to my livelihood. Elias calculated that the potential damages to my lifetime earning capacity, my pension, and my professional reputation were enormous. We were not going to sue her for an apology. We were preparing a civil suit worth millions of dollars. But I did not just want Diane. I wanted the entire network of enablers who thought it was acceptable to vandalize my property and harass me online. I opened a secondary terminal and pulled up the public community forums where Diane had shared her fabricated story. As a cyber intelligence officer, tracking digital footprints is practically my second nature. I did not need to hack into anything. People are remarkably careless with their open source data. I began systematically archiving every single hateful comment, every shared post, and every direct threat. I did not just take screenshots. I utilized specialized software to capture the raw HTML data and preserve the metadata of every interaction. I cross-referenced the user profiles of the most vicious commenters with public property records and voter registration databases. Within 2 hours, I had compiled a pristine, legally admissible spreadsheet detailing the real names, physical addresses, and IP addresses of the neighbors who had participated in the targeted harassment campaign. I transmitted the encrypted file to Elias. I told him to draft preservation of evidence letters, also known as spoliation letters, to every single individual on that list. We would not send them yet, but I wanted them ready. When the time came, these suburban bullies who felt so brave typing slurs behind their keyboards would receive formal legal notice that they were named as co-defendants in a multi-million-dollar defamation and harassment lawsuit. They would learn very quickly that actions on the internet have severe real-world financial consequences. Elias was impressed, but he directed my attention back to the crowdfunding campaign itself. He pointed out the most critical element of our strategy. Diane had linked a bank account to receive the payouts from the donations. Because Elias had already secured an emergency financial injunction, freezing all of Brandon's marital assets, Brandon was completely cut off from our joint cash. He was relying on his mother to funnel this raised money to him so he could pay the rent on Vanessa's luxury apartment and keep his mistress in the dark about his impending bankruptcy. Elias asked if I wanted him to issue an immediate cease and desist order to the crowdfunding platform to shut the page down. I adamantly refused. I told Elias to let the campaign run, let Diane continue to share it, let the neighborhood keep donating. I explained that every single dollar deposited into that account, under the false premise of a fabricated DNA test, was another count of federal wire fraud. If we shut the page down now, they could argue it was a misunderstanding. But if we let the funds accumulate, and if we let Diane initiate a transfer to Brandon's hidden corporate accounts, we would have an ironclad, indisputable money trail. We would have definitive proof that Brandon and his mother were colluding to defraud the public across state lines. Elias nodded in agreement, recognizing the lethal precision of the plan. He promised to draft the subpoenas for the financial routing data so that the moment the funds were moved, we would intercept the transaction logs. We ended the secure call, leaving me to my unclassified duties. Throughout the afternoon, my phone periodically buzzed with updates from the neighborhood forum. Diane was posting again. She uploaded a video of herself standing in her pristine kitchen, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. She dramatically lamented to the camera about how much she missed her grandson Leo. She claimed I was a cruel, vindictive woman keeping a child away from his loving family out of pure spite. She begged her friends to keep sharing the campaign link so her son could hire a lawyer to bring his boy home. I watched the video with absolutely zero emotional reaction. I did not feel hurt, and I certainly did not feel guilty. I simply downloaded the video file, preserved the metadata, and dropped it into the evidence folder labeled for Elias. Diane was digging her own grave with a silver shovel, and I was more than happy to let her keep digging until she hit rock bottom. Later that day, I received a notification from the Judge Advocate General Office. Captain Reed informed me that the military-supervised DNA test had been officially scheduled for the following morning at the base medical facility. The court order Elias had secured forced Brandon to comply. If Brandon failed to show up, the civilian family court would hold him in contempt, and the military command would immediately invalidate his accusations against me. He had no choice but to face the music. I logged out of my workstation and prepared to head to the Child Development Center to pick up Leo. The media counterattack was fully established. I had not spoken a single word in my own defense online. I had not stooped to their level of public screaming and dramatic theatrics. Instead, I had quietly built an invisible, inescapable legal net around my husband and my mother-in-law. They thought they were controlling the narrative, completely unaware that I was controlling the entire battlefield. I drove home that evening, passing the exact neighbors who had sent me vile messages earlier that morning. They looked away quickly when my car rolled down the street. They thought I was returning home in shame. They had absolutely no idea that in a matter of days they would be sitting across from high-powered lawyers scrambling to explain their behavior to a federal judge. I pulled into my driveway, ignoring the red paint still splashed across my vandalized vehicle. It was just collateral damage in a war I was destined to win. I carried Leo inside, locked the doors, and prepared myself for the next phase of the operation. Tomorrow, the fake science Brandon had used to ambush me would be obliterated by real medicine. And the day after that, he would have to sit in a deposition chair and swear under oath. The dominoes were lined up perfectly. All I had to do was push the first one. The morning of the military-supervised DNA test arrived with a heavy downpour. I secured Leo in his car seat and drove to the base medical facility. The clinical, highly secure environment was the exact opposite of the fraudulent online clinic Brandon had used for his fabricated document. Two military police officers stood near the entrance, ensuring that the chain of custody for this legal evidence would be absolute. I carried Leo inside and met Captain Reed from the Judge Advocate General office, who was present to officially observe the procedure on behalf of my command. Brandon arrived 10 minutes late. He walked through the sliding glass doors wearing a tailored suit projecting an aura of aggrieved victimhood. He tried to glare at me, but his eyes darted nervously to the military police and the sterile, highly regulated surroundings. This was not his mother's living room. He could not scream his way to a victory here. The presiding medical officer, a no-nonsense major in the medical corps, instructed us to sit in separate examination rooms. The swabbing process was swift and thoroughly documented. A nurse swabbed the inside of my cheek, then Leo's, placing the samples into tamper-evident vials sealed with barcodes. I watched them escort Brandon into the adjacent room to perform the exact same procedure. When he emerged, he looked visibly tense. He tried to initiate a conversation with Captain Reed, claiming he just wanted the truth to come out, but the captain simply offered a rigid nod and advised him to direct all communications through his civilian attorney. Brandon left the facility looking significantly less confident than when he arrived. The expedited results took exactly 72 hours. Those 3 days were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I continued my unclassified duties at the Cyber Intelligence Command Center, ignoring the lingering stares from colleagues who had undoubtedly heard rumors of the UCMJ investigation. I spent my evenings playing with Leo, building block towers, and reading him stories fiercely shielding his innocence from the legal war raging around him. On Thursday morning, Elias summoned me to the downtown family courthouse for a preliminary hearing. The judge had mandated an in-person appearance to formally enter the DNA results into the civilian court record and address the emergency financial injunctions Elias had filed. I walked into the polished courtroom wearing my service dress uniform. I wanted the judge, the bailiffs, and Brandon to see exactly who they were dealing with. Elias stood beside me, his briefcase resting on the heavy oak table. Across the aisle, Brandon sat next to his newly hired defense attorney. Diane had apparently dipped deep into her fraudulent crowdfunding campaign to secure legal representation for her son. Brandon looked incredibly smug, adjusting his tie and whispering confidently to his lawyer. He still believed he was controlling the narrative. The judge, a severe-looking woman with decades of family law experience, took her seat at the bench. She bypassed the standard pleasantries and immediately unsealed the manila envelope delivered directly from the military medical facility. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. You could hear the crisp sound of the paper tearing. The judge adjusted her reading glasses and scanned the official laboratory report. She looked up and locked eyes with Brandon. She stated for the official record that the chain of custody was flawless and the scientific results were conclusive. The probability of paternity was 99.99%. Leo was undeniably and legally Brandon's biological son. The judge then turned her stern gaze toward Brandon's attorney. She warned him that submitting fraudulent medical documents to a military command and attempting to initiate a false federal investigation carried severe consequences. She demanded to know how his client intended to explain the fabricated DNA test he had previously presented. This was the moment an average person would have broken down, apologized, or claimed they had been misled by a faulty clinic. But Brandon was not average. He was a cornered predator desperate for cash. I watched his face closely. There was no shock. There was no realization of a terrible mistake. The mask of the heartbroken, betrayed husband dissolved instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating smirk. He leaned back in his chair and adjusted his cuffs. He did not look at the judge. He looked directly at me. His attorney stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. He stated that his client had acted out of emotional distress based on false suspicions, but they were pleased to have the paternity officially confirmed. Then the attorney executed the exact tactical pivot I had predicted. Since paternity is no longer in question, the attorney announced my client fully acknowledges his responsibilities as a father. Therefore, we are formally filing for a standard dissolution of marriage. We demand an equitable 50-50 division of all marital assets, including the immediate sale of the primary residence, to disperse the equity. The attorney did not stop there. He raised his voice, ensuring the entire courtroom heard his next argument. Furthermore, my client is demanding 50-50 joint legal and physical custody of the minor child. However, given the nature of the mother's employment, we will be petitioning for my client to be designated as the primary residential parent. Brandon leaned forward, his smirk widening into a grin. He spoke out of turn, addressing me directly across the aisle. "You heard him, Gemma. He is my son. That means we split everything down the middle. Half the house, half the savings, half of everything you own. And since you are an active duty military officer who works erratic hours and faces potential overseas deployments, the court will clearly see that you cannot provide a stable daily environment. The judge will give Leo to me. You will be paying me child support for the next 17 years. The sheer audacity of his pivot echoed through the courtroom. He had just spent an entire week publicly accusing me of adultery and trying to disown his own child. Now that his lie was exposed, he instantly flipped his strategy, claiming to be a devoted father who deserved to take my son and my money simply because I served my country. He was weaponizing my military service, twisting my dedication to national security into a liability in family court. He thought this was his masterstroke. He thought that by dropping the adultery angle and forcing a standard division of assets, he could still force the sale of my house and secure a massive monthly income through child support. He believed he had successfully maneuvered out of the trap and was back on the path to funding Vanessa's luxury lifestyle. The judge slammed her gavel, ordering Brandon to remain silent and directing his attorney to control his client. She noted his demands for the record, stating that asset division and custody arrangements would be addressed in the upcoming formal hearings. She upheld the emergency financial injunctions Elias had secured, keeping Brandon's accounts frozen until the next court date, and adjourned the preliminary session. As the courtroom cleared, Brandon walked past my table. He stopped just inches away from me, exuding arrogance. He whispered that I had fought a good fight, but he had won. He told me to start packing my bags because the house would be on the market by the end of the month and he would see me at the custody exchange. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the man I had once loved and felt absolutely nothing but clinical detachment. He had just committed himself to a legal strategy built on claiming his rightful half of our marital assets. He was demanding a comprehensive financial audit to ensure the court split our wealth perfectly down the middle. I turned to Elias. My attorney was packing his briefcase, and though his face was professional, his eyes were gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. Brandon had just demanded a full financial disclosure on the legal record. He had practically begged the judge to open the books and divide everything we shared. Elias and I walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight. Brandon thought he was demanding half of my equity. He had absolutely no idea that by forcing a 50-50 division of our marital estate, he had just legally bound me to introduce his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses, his secret six-figure credit card debt, and his luxury apartment lease into the formal court proceedings. He thought he was about to get a massive payout. I knew he was about to get served with half of a financial black hole. The real war was about to begin, and Brandon had just handed me the weapon to destroy him. 2 weeks later, the formal deposition took place in the heavily air-conditioned conference room of Elias's downtown law firm. The space was designed for psychological warfare. The heavy mahogany table, the stark lighting, and the absolute silence of the room were meant to intimidate. A certified court reporter sat at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine, ready to permanently record every single syllable spoken. Brandon walked into the room wearing a sharply tailored suit he had undoubtedly purchased on one of his hidden credit cards. He looked incredibly arrogant. His defense attorney, a man whose fees were entirely funded by Diane's fraudulent crowdfunding campaign, sat down next to him and arranged his files. Brandon leaned back in his leather chair and offered me a condescending smirk. He truly believed this deposition was a mere formality. He thought Elias was just going to ask standard questions about my military income and the equity in my house so they could calculate his 50% payout. The court reporter asked Brandon to raise his right hand. He casually swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury. I sat completely still beside Elias, a legal pad and a pen resting on the table in front of me. As an intelligence officer, my job is to gather data, analyze behavioral patterns, and let the target incriminate themselves. I was not there to argue. I was not there to display anger or heartbreak. I was simply a quiet observer documenting his destruction. Elias began the questioning with a series of dull standard inquiries to establish Brandon's identity, his employment history, and our marital timeline. Brandon answered with an air of bored confidence. He kept glancing in my direction, trying to assert dominance, wanting to see me squirm as he laid out his timeline for our inevitable divorce. Elias let him play the confident executive for 20 minutes, lulling him into a false sense of absolute security. Then Elias seamlessly shifted the topic to our marital finances. Elias pulled a single sheet of paper from his briefcase and laid it flat on the table. He asked Brandon to state for the record who handled the primary banking responsibilities during our marriage. Brandon puffed out his chest and proudly stated that he managed all of our financial portfolios, claiming he took on the burden to support the family while I was frequently distracted by my military duties. Elias nodded slowly. He asked Brandon if he could account for the complete depletion of a high-yield savings account designated for our son's college education. Brandon did not flinch. He stated under oath that the funds had been utilized for necessary household expenses and general cost of living increases over the past year. He claimed that inflation and the costs of raising a child had simply drained our reserves. Elias pressed further. He asked Brandon if he currently held or had ever held any offshore financial accounts, digital wallets, or cryptocurrency portfolios during the marriage. I watched Brandon's eyes narrow for a fraction of a second. He was calculating the risk. He assumed my military job kept me too busy to ever look at a banking router, and he assumed Elias was just fishing blindly. Brandon looked directly at the court reporter and stated firmly that he did not hold any cryptocurrency assets, nor had he ever wired marital funds to any offshore exchanges. I made a single, precise checkmark on my legal pad. Elias did not present the recovered spreadsheets. He did not pull out the digital footprint I had extracted from Brandon's wiped hard drive. In a deposition, the goal is not to confront the liar with the evidence immediately. The goal is to let them lock themselves into the lie on the federal record. Elias pivoted to the topic of debt. He asked Brandon to list all outstanding financial liabilities. Brandon confidently listed our mortgage and a single joint credit card we used for emergency household repairs. Elias asked if Brandon possessed any personal loans, secondary credit lines, or hidden debt that had not been disclosed to me. Brandon scoffed, acting deeply offended by the question. He stated under oath that he had absolutely zero hidden debts and characterized the inquiry as a desperate attempt to paint him as financially irresponsible. I made a second checkmark on my legal pad. He had just lied about $250,000 in predatory loans and maxed out credit cards. Elias steepled his fingers, his expression completely blank. He asked Brandon about his daily routine and expenditures. He specifically asked if Brandon had purchased any luxury jewelry or high-end designer goods within the last 6 months. Brandon laughed aloud this time, looking at his attorney. He testified that as a family living on a military salary and standard civilian wages, luxury goods were entirely out of the question. He categorically denied purchasing any diamonds, jewelry, or designer accessories. Elias asked if Brandon currently held a residential lease or paid utilities for any property other than our suburban home. Brandon firmly answered no. He stated that our marital home was his only residence and his only real estate liability. I made a third checkmark. The web was tightening. Elias let a heavy silence fill the room. The court reporter's machine stopped clicking. Elias looked down at his notes, then looked up, locking his predatory gaze entirely on my husband. Elias asked Brandon if he frequently visited the downtown financial district. Brandon said he sometimes went there for business meetings. Elias asked if Brandon knew a woman residing in a luxury high-rise in that specific district. Brandon's posture stiffened. His attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing a trap, but lacking the context to object. Elias leaned across the mahogany table. He asked Brandon clearly and deliberately if he was romantically involved with or providing financial support to a 25-year-old woman named Vanessa. The color drained from Brandon's face. For the first time since the deposition began, his arrogant facade cracked. He looked at me, searching my blank expression for any sign of how much I actually knew. He looked at his attorney, who was gesturing for him to answer the question carefully. Brandon swallowed hard. He knew that admitting to an affair would destroy his pristine narrative of being the victimized husband. He knew that admitting he funded a mistress would ruin his chances of getting a 50-50 split. His greed overrode his survival instinct. Brandon looked at the court reporter. He stated under oath that he had absolutely no idea who Vanessa was. He testified that he was entirely faithful during our marriage, that he had never provided financial support to anyone outside our household, and that the name Vanessa meant nothing to him. Elias asked one final question. He asked Brandon if he was currently expecting a child with any woman other than his lawful wife. Brandon sneered, regaining a fraction of his bravado. He stated under oath that he had only one child, Leo, and any suggestion otherwise was a pathetic, vindictive smear tactic. I made my final checkmark on the legal pad. Elias thanked Brandon for his time and stated he had no further questions. The court reporter packed up her equipment. Brandon's attorney looked relieved that the session was over without any explosive revelations. Brandon stood up, straightening his jacket, and shot me a triumphant glare. He believed he had navigated the legal minefield flawlessly. He thought he had successfully hidden his financial ruin, his mistress, and his impending second child. He walked out of the conference room, convinced that he was weeks away from cashing out half the equity in my home. Once the door clicked shut and we were entirely alone, Elias turned to me. A slow, chilling smile spread across his face. I looked down at my legal pad. Brandon had not just told a few white lies to protect his pride. He had deliberately lied under oath about hidden financial assets, massive concealed debts, property leases, and his pregnant mistress. Perjury during a sworn deposition in a civil proceeding involving hundreds of thousands of dollars is a severe federal and state offense. I closed my legal pad and placed my pen in my pocket. Brandon wanted to destroy my military career by fabricating a crime. Instead, he had just willingly sat in a chair, raised his right hand, and committed a genuine felony on the official legal record. He had handed us the absolute power to trigger a criminal indictment. The deposition was a spectacular success. The trap had clamped shut and the predator was officially caught inside. But Elias and I were not finished. While Brandon was busy perjuring himself over his downtown mistress, my investigative protocol had unearthed something even more catastrophic lurking in the suburban background. It was time to shift my focus to the woman who started the smear campaign. It was time to look into Diane's basement. I returned to my secure home network that evening after putting Leo to sleep. The deposition had successfully secured Brandon's criminal perjury on the official legal record, but my analytical mind was still snagged on a single glaring mathematical discrepancy. The trap had clamped shut regarding his hidden mistress and his credit card debt, but a massive piece of the financial puzzle was still missing. Brandon's cryptocurrency losses were absolutely staggering. I had tracked the offshore exchanges and the margin calls, calculating the sheer volume of his failed trades. To leverage that kind of catastrophic debt on premium trading platforms, he needed an initial injection of massive capital. A standard corporate salary and our joint savings were not nearly enough to satisfy the collateral requirements of those high-tier exchanges. Brandon had to have presented a hard asset to secure his initial funding before the market crashed and wiped him out. He could not use my house. My name was the sole name on the deed the property was purchased prior to our marriage, and the title was heavily protected under military relief laws. He had zero legal leverage over my real estate. So what hard asset did he use to get the cash? I sat in the dark of my home office, the glow of multiple monitors reflecting in my eyes. I ran a targeted search query through the state property and commercial databases, filtering the parameters using the exact shell LLC Brandon had created to fund Vanessa's luxury apartment. The system churned through the public county records, compiling business filings, tax assessments, and recorded liens. When the results finally populated on my encrypted screen, the breath hitched in my throat. The shell LLC was directly linked to a massive commercial lending firm. The primary collateral listed to secure that massive cash injection was a 4-bedroom suburban house located just 15 miles away. It was Diane's house. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I pulled the digital mortgage filings and property liens directly from the county clerk's database. Diane was a 62-year-old widow who constantly bragged to her neighborhood bridge club that her late husband had paid off their mortgage 20 years ago. Her home was her ultimate status symbol, her fortress of suburban superiority that proved she was part of the established upper middle class. Yet looking at the glowing screen, I saw a home equity line of credit maximized to its absolute limit. The loan was for over $300,000. I downloaded the digitized signature pages from the lending agreement. The documents had been executed electronically exactly 8 months ago, precisely aligning with the time frame when Brandon's cryptocurrency gambling escalated into a full-blown addiction, and right around the time Vanessa became pregnant. The signature on the digital dotted line read Diane's full legal name. However, as an intelligence officer, I do not just look at the ink on a page, I look at the metadata. I extracted the raw source code from the document file to isolate the IP address attached to the digital notary seal and the DocuSign execution stamp. The geographic ping did not originate from Diane's suburban neighborhood. It did not originate from a bank office. The IP address matched the local node of our own home internet router. Specifically, the execution command came directly from the MAC address of Brandon's desktop computer, sitting just 3 feet away from me in this very room. The realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Brandon had not just lied to me, he had not just cheated on me, he had financially cannibalized his own mother, he had secretly taken out a massive secondary mortgage on the house Diane had lived in for 30 years by forging her electronic signature. He took $300,000 of his mother's life equity, pumped it into an offshore crypto exchange, and lost every single penny of it in a disastrous market crash. I immediately checked the loan servicer's public notices portal. Brandon had not made a payment on that massive loan in over 90 days. The account was in severe default. A notice of default had already been issued by the bank, but Brandon had cleverly shielded the correspondence by using his Shell LLC's downtown mailing address, so Diane would never see the warning letters arriving in her mailbox. The bank was actively preparing to foreclose on the property. Diane was living on borrowed time in a house she no longer legally controlled. I leaned back in my chair and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the neighborhood community forum where Diane had launched her vicious smear campaign against me. She was currently broadcasting a live video stream to her followers. I clicked on the video. Diane was standing in her pristine, newly remodeled kitchen. The marble countertops and expensive stainless steel appliances gleamed in the background. It was the exact kitchen that was currently legally owned by a predatory lending bank. Diane looked directly into her smartphone camera, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She was continuing her vicious, tearful crusade against me. She told her audience of suburban housewives that I was a greedy, manipulative woman who used my military uniform as a shield to hide my terrible morals. She thanked everyone for donating to her crowdfunding campaign, claiming the funds were crucial to helping Brandon secure a new home for himself and Leo once he rescued his son from my toxic environment. She proudly stated that her home would always be a safe haven for her golden boy, a place where he could rebuild his life after escaping my cruelty. I watched her performative tears with a mixture of absolute disgust and chilling amusement. This woman was publicly rallying a mob to destroy my military career and steal my child, completely oblivious to the fact that her golden boy had already sold the ground beneath her feet. She was fiercely defending a man who had forged her signature, stolen her life savings, and doomed her to an inevitable, humiliating eviction. The bank was going to arrive with the local sheriff to seize that house and throw all her belongings onto the front lawn any day now, and she was busy complaining about my morality on the internet. I captured the live video stream, preserving her arrogant declarations alongside the forged loan documents, the defaulted payment ledgers, and the IP address logs mapping the forgery directly to Brandon. This was the ultimate weapon. Elias and I had Brandon locked in a perjury trap regarding Vanessa and the hidden debts, but revealing this mortgage fraud would completely obliterate the mother-son alliance. Brandon was relying entirely on Diane's social network and her illicit crowdfunding money to keep his legal defense afloat. He was using her blind loyalty as his primary shield. Once Diane realized her precious son had rendered her homeless and destitute to fund a pregnant mistress downtown, she would tear him apart with her own bare hands. The family loyalty they claimed was so impenetrable was actually built on a massive financial crime. I did not send a single message to Diane. I did not log into the neighborhood forum to expose the truth and ruin her live broadcast. An amateur would have posted the foreclosure documents in the comment section for immediate gratification, hungry for the quick revenge of internet drama. But a professional waits for the battlefield to be perfectly arranged. A professional lets the enemy march deeply into a trap before sealing the exits. I packaged the digital files into a heavily encrypted dossier and transmitted it directly to Elias with a high-priority tactical flag. We were not going to mention a single word of this during any standard court hearings. We needed a highly specific environment to drop this nuclear warhead. We needed a scenario where Brandon thought he was negotiating from a position of absolute strength, surrounded by his fiercely loyal family, completely unaware that the floor was about to give way beneath him. I powered down my workstation and walked to the window, looking out into the quiet suburban night. Brandon had mistaken my disciplined silence for submission. Diane had mistaken my lack of public retaliation for fear. They had spent weeks trying to build a legal and social cage for me, weaving lies and rallying the public completely blind to the fact that they were standing on a live financial landmine. I smiled, my reflection staring back at me in the dark glass of the window. The trap was fully constructed, the explosive charges were wired. It was time to invite my husband and my mother-in-law to a mediation session they would never forget. The very next afternoon, a heavy knock echoed through the house. I checked the security camera feed on my phone. Standing on my front porch was Jason, Brandon's older brother. Jason had always cultivated the persona of the rational, level-headed sibling. He worked in middle management at an insurance firm and prided himself on being the family diplomat. I knew better. In a family of narcissists, the peacemaker is usually just the most effective manipulator, deploying a calm voice to execute the exact same toxic agenda. I opened the door. He offered a weary, sympathetic smile, holding his hands up in a gesture of harmlessness. He asked if we could talk, just the two of us, no lawyers, no screaming. I stepped aside and led him into the foyer. I guided him toward the living room, ensuring he sat on the sofa facing the large bay window. As he sat down, he pulled his smartphone from his jacket pocket and placed it face down on the glass coffee table. The camera lens was pointing slightly toward me, and the microphone was completely unobstructed. I recognized the tactic instantly. It was a classic amateur surveillance maneuver. He was recording our conversation. Jason leaned forward, clasping his hands together, resting on his knees. He launched into a carefully rehearsed speech. He told me the family was being torn apart. He claimed Brandon was an emotional wreck, completely devastated by the impending divorce, and that Diane was suffering from stress-induced heart palpitations due to the online backlash. Then he delivered his pitch. He said litigation would bankrupt both of us. He proposed a clean, quiet solution. If I simply agreed to hand over a lump sum of cash, maybe $100,000, Brandon would immediately drop the military complaints, withdraw his demand for the house, and walk away peacefully. He framed it as a small price to pay to save my military career and keep Leo in a stable environment. Jason pushed further, actively trying to bait me into a confession. He kept using leading phrases carefully designed for his hidden microphone. He said things like how we all make terrible mistakes during long deployments, and if I just admitted I slipped up, they could keep this out of the federal courts. He suggested that if I had any secret accounts I was hiding, now was the time to use them to buy my freedom. He wanted me on tape admitting to the adultery charge or acknowledging hidden assets. He thought he was outsmarting a military intelligence officer with a basic smartphone voice memo app. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. If Brandon and Diane needed to feel victorious to walk blindly into my trap, I would hand them a platinum trophy. I let my shoulders slump. I broke eye contact and stared at my hands in my lap. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, perfectly mimicking the physiological response of a woman who had finally reached her absolute breaking point. I let my voice tremble, pitching it just loud enough to be clearly picked up by his device. I told Jason that I was utterly exhausted. I said the neighborhood harassment, the vandalism on my car, and the looming threat of a court-martial were destroying me mentally. I covered my face with my hands, letting out a dry, tearless sob that conveyed total defeat. I told him I could not fight the pressure anymore. I explicitly stated that I just wanted the public humiliation to stop, and I was willing to pay whatever Brandon wanted to make this nightmare end. I carefully avoided admitting to any actual infidelity or financial crimes, using vague language of surrender that sounded like a confession to a layman, but held absolutely zero legal weight in a military tribunal. Jason's posture relaxed immediately. A flicker of arrogant triumph crossed his face. He adopted a soothing, paternal tone, telling me that surrendering was the smartest choice I could possibly make. He promised that if I paid Brandon the money, the entire situation would vanish quietly. He asked if I was ready to sign an official agreement to transfer the funds and concede to Brandon's narrative on paper. I looked up at him, my expression a perfect mask of broken resignation. I agreed to schedule a formal mediation session this coming Saturday at Elias's downtown law office to sign the settlement. But I laid out one absolute non-negotiable condition. I told Jason that if I was going to surrender a massive sum of money and accept defeat, I needed the entire core family present. I demanded that Brandon, Diane, and Jason all be in that conference room. I framed it as a desperate need for closure. I said I wanted to look them in the eye, apologize properly, and finalize the separation with the whole family witnessing my surrender. I pleaded that I needed them to see me sign the papers so they would finally be satisfied and leave me in peace. Jason practically vibrated with excitement. He had not only secured my verbal surrender on tape, but he had also just arranged for a grand public victory lap for his mother and brother. He envisioned a scenario where the mighty military officer was forced to grovel before his family. He eagerly promised that they would all be there on Saturday morning without fail. He stood up, grabbing his phone from the table and hastily slipping it back into his pocket. He offered me a fake, pitying smile and practically sprinted out the front door, desperate to deliver the recording to his triumphant family. The second my front door clicked into its lock, my posture snapped straight. The trembling vanished instantly. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket and dialed my attorney. Elias answered on the second ring. I told him to book his largest, most intimidating conference room for Saturday morning. I confirmed that the entire hostile family unit would be in attendance, expecting to strip me of my assets and watch me beg for mercy. Elias chuckled a low, dangerous sound over the line. He asked if I was ready to drop the financial guillotine on the entire bloodline. I confirmed that the execution was scheduled for the weekend and instructed him to have the federal fraud documents, the foreclosure notices, and the subpoenas printed on high-quality paper. I wanted the evidence to feel heavy when we dropped it on the table. I hung up the phone and looked around my quiet living room. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was arriving on Saturday to hand them a fortune and my dignity. They had no idea I was bringing a tactical nightmare that would level their entire existence. The final pieces were moving into place. The bait was taken. Now all I had to do was send one last invitation to a very specific pregnant woman across town. The assembly of the package required the precision of a psychological operative. I sat at the desk in my home office and laid out a heavy, unmarked manila envelope. This was not going to be a simple letter. This was a financial and legal autopsy of the man Vanessa thought was her wealthy benefactor. I printed the offshore cryptocurrency exchange ledgers, showing a zero balance. I printed the statements from his 6 maxed-out credit cards. I printed the defaulted loan agreements, and most importantly, the impending foreclosure notice on Diane's house. I wanted Vanessa to see exactly what kind of man was paying her rent. He was not a successful investor. He was a sinking ship, and she was shackled to the anchor. Next came the legal binding. Elias had worked his magic in the civilian courts. He drafted a formal subpoena, ducis tecum. This document legally compelled Vanessa to appear at our scheduled mediation on Saturday morning and ordered her to bring all financial records, gift receipts, and lease agreements provided by Brandon. It explicitly named her as a material witness in a high-stakes family court case involving the fraudulent dissipation of marital assets. To ensure maximum psychological impact, I typed a single-page letter to accompany the legal documents. The letter was unsigned, completely anonymous, but ruthlessly direct. I warned her that her financial guarantor was entirely bankrupt. I explained that every diamond she wore, every designer bag she carried, and every month of rent for her luxury high-rise had been paid for with stolen funds that were currently being tracked by forensic accountants and federal investigators. I concluded the letter with a stark ultimatum. I told her that if she failed to appear at the law office on Saturday morning, Elias would immediately file a motion to name her as a co-conspirator in a federal wire fraud and asset concealment lawsuit. She would be held jointly liable for $250,000 in debt. She had 48 hours to decide if she wanted to be a witness for the plaintiff or a target for the prosecution. I did not rely on the Postal Service for something this critical. This required absolute certainty. Elias hired a private process server, a retired police detective known for his unyielding efficiency and intimidating presence. I gave him Vanessa's address and a physical description. I instructed him to serve her directly in the lobby of her luxury building and to ensure she understood the extreme gravity of the documents she was receiving. At 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, my secure phone pinged with a notification. The process server sent a brief professional message. The target had been successfully served. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself to picture the exact sequence of events unfolding across town. Vanessa likely returning from a leisurely lunch or a prenatal appointment, being approached by a stern man, handing her a thick stack of legal terror. I imagined her taking the elevator up to her expensive stolen apartment, slicing open the envelope and pulling out the documents. The realization would hit her like a freight train. She was 25 years old, heavily pregnant, and completely dependent on a man who was mathematically ruined. The documents proved that Brandon had no secret wealth. The opulent lifestyle he had sold her was a complete fabrication. The money he used to court her was stolen from a military officer and a toddler's college fund. Panic is a highly predictable human response. When a predator's facade is shattered, the parasite attached to them usually scrambles to survive. I knew Vanessa would frantically try to call Brandon. I also knew exactly how Brandon would react. He would lie to her. He would probably brush off her panicked questions, claim the documents were just a desperate intimidation tactic from his crazy soon-to-be ex-wife, and promise to handle it. He would tell her not to worry. He would tell her to completely ignore the subpoena. But Vanessa was looking at official bank letterheads and court-stamped legal summons. The stark black and white numbers detailing hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt would scream much louder than Brandon's smooth excuses. She had a choice to make. She could trust the man who had just been exposed as a catastrophic liar, or she could show up to the mediation to save her own skin and avoid being dragged into federal court. Self-preservation always wins. I gave her exactly enough time to stew in her terror, but not enough time to hire a defense attorney to find a loophole. Friday evening settled over my house with a quiet intensity. The storm of the past week had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear night. I put Leo to bed, lingering a moment longer to watch him sleep. My son was the reason I had not broken down when the ambush first happened. He was the reason I transformed my grief and betrayal into a tactical strike. Tomorrow, I was going to secure his future permanently and ensure the people who tried to destroy us would never have the power to hurt anyone again. I walked to my closet and carefully selected my outfit for the mediation. I did not choose my military uniform. Brandon, Diane, and Jason expected me to arrive looking defeated, broken, and desperate. If I wore my uniform, they might sense the authority and brace themselves for a fight. Instead, I chose a simple, understated charcoal suit. It was professional, unassuming, and perfectly crafted to make them underestimate me one final time. I packed my briefcase. I slid in the encrypted flash drives, the pristine copies of the foreclosure notices the FBI shell company reports, and the printed transcript of the recorded conversation Jason had so eagerly facilitated. Every single document was a nail in their collective coffin. My phone remained completely silent. Jason had not reached out again, likely afraid of spooking his fragile prey. Diane had stopped posting on her neighborhood forum, probably busy coordinating her triumphant outfit for the morning. Brandon was undoubtedly pacing his room at his mother's house, rehearsing the magnanimous speech he would give when I handed him the settlement money and begged for mercy. They were all sleeping soundly, completely intoxicated by their imaginary victory. I set my alarm for 6 in the morning. The final act was ready. The cast of characters had been successfully manipulated onto the stage. Brandon thought he was the director of this play. He had no idea the theater was rigged with explosives, and I was holding the only detonator. I turned off the bedside lamp and closed my eyes, falling into a deep, dreamless sleep. Tomorrow I was going to remove every remaining escape route. The morning sunlight hit the glass facades of downtown, reflecting a brilliant, blinding glare as I parked my car in the secure garage beneath Elias's law firm. I took the private elevator up to the top floor, my charcoal suit crisp, my briefcase heavy in my hand. Elias was already waiting in the main conference room. He had arranged the space flawlessly. He sat at the head of the massive mahogany table flanked by stacks of perfectly bound legal files. He gave me a single sharp nod as I took my seat to his right. We did not need to review the strategy. We were simply waiting for the targets to arrive. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. Brandon strode into the room first, projecting the aura of a conquering king returning to claim his spoils. He wore a brand new navy suit and a smug, patronizing smile. Diane followed closely behind him, her chin tilted upward, her eyes sweeping over me with undisguised contempt. Jason brought up the rear, carrying a leather folio and looking immensely pleased with himself, entirely convinced that his amateur negotiation tactics had broken my spirit. They took their seats across from us. The contrast in our postures was stark. Brandon leaned far back in his chair, draping one arm casually over the empty seat beside him. Diane placed her designer handbag on the table with a loud, deliberate thud. Diane could not even wait for the formal introductions to conclude before launching her opening strike. She looked at me, a nasty, victorious smirk twisting her features, and broke the silence. "Finally, you know your place and spit out the money," she sneered, her voice dripping with suburban arrogance. "I told Brandon not to go easy on you. You dragged our family name through the mud, but at least you finally realized you cannot fight us and win. Hand over the settlement check so my son can go buy a house that actually belongs to him." Jason leaned forward, playing the magnanimous peacekeeper. He told Elias that they were ready to review the surrender documents. He pompously added that Brandon was willing to drop the military complaints and finalize a quiet, uncontested divorce, provided the lump sum payment I promised was sufficient to cover Brandon's emotional distress. Brandon simply stared at me, tapping his fingers on the table. He demanded I hand over the paperwork. He explicitly stated that he wanted my written apology included in the settlement file, just as Jason had promised him. He wanted it all in writing so he could hold it over my head for the rest of my life. I looked at the three of them. They were completely intoxicated by their own delusions. They had walked into a high-powered law firm, believing they were the predators, utterly blind to the fact that they were sitting inside a cage. I smiled. It was not a smile of defeat, nor was it a smile of friendly reconciliation. It was the cold, absolute smile of an intelligence officer who had just secured the final piece of actionable data. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy document bound in a blue legal cover. I did not say a word. I simply slid it across the smooth mahogany surface. It glided perfectly, coming to a stop directly in front of Brandon's resting hands. Brandon chuckled, assuming this was the financial surrender he had demanded. He flipped open the heavy cover, expecting to see a structured payout schedule and a bank draft. Instead, his eyes locked onto the bold black lettering at the very top of the first page. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked physically ill. His arrogant posture collapsed. He stared at the federal seal printed on the document, his hands beginning to tremble violently. Diane frowned, annoyed by her son's sudden silence. She asked him what the paper said and demanded to know the exact amount of the check I had provided. Brandon could not speak. His throat worked, but no sound came out. I folded my hands on the table and leaned forward, breaking the silence with clinical precision. I informed Diane that there was no settlement check. I explained that the document her son was currently shaking over was a formal copy of a comprehensive intelligence dossier and a criminal complaint. I looked directly into Brandon's terrified eyes and delivered the first lethal blow. I told him that the paperwork he was holding was a copy of the file I had submitted to the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 2 weeks ago. Jason bolted upright in his chair, his fake diplomatic persona shattering instantly. He demanded to know what I was talking about. Elias took over, his voice resonating with lethal legal authority. He addressed the opposite side of the table, stating that my intelligence background made me a mandatory reporter for specific financial crimes. He explained that when Brandon decided to systematically drain our marital accounts and funnel the money through offshore cryptocurrency tumblers to hide his assets, he had crossed state and international lines using digital telecommunications. I picked up the narrative, ensuring they understood the absolute gravity of the situation. I explicitly stated that routing stolen funds through domestic banks into foreign digital exchanges to hide assets from a spouse during a divorce proceeding is the textbook definition of federal wire fraud. I told Brandon that he had not just lied to a family court judge, he had utilized interstate wire facilities to execute a fraudulent scheme. Diane let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I was bluffing. She claimed I was just using big words to scare her son out of taking his rightful half of my money. She turned to Jason and demanded he do something to stop this ridiculous intimidation tactic. Jason was not laughing. He stared at the federal tracking numbers printed clearly on the document in front of his brother. He slowly realized that this was not a bluff. I turned my attention to Diane. I informed her that she should probably review the second section of that federal report because her name was listed right next to her son's as a co-conspirator. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her chest. She shrieked that she had done absolutely nothing wrong and had never touched any cryptocurrency in her life. Elias stepped in to provide a brutal legal education. He informed Diane that she had launched a public crowdfunding campaign using a digital platform based in California. She had solicited donations from neighbors across state lines using the internet. And most importantly, she had raised those funds based entirely on a fabricated medical document and a fabricated story of adultery. Elias stated that gathering money across state lines using a fraudulent narrative is also classified as federal wire fraud. I watched the realization hit them like a physical strike. I told Diane that every single dollar she had collected from her church friends and her neighborhood bridge club was currently sitting in a frozen account under federal review. I explained that by creating that campaign to pay for Brandon's imaginary custody battle, she had legally tied herself to his criminal enterprise. Brandon finally found his voice. It was a weak, pathetic rasp. He tried to claim that the FBI would never care about a messy divorce. He stammered that family court issues happen all the time, and the feds had bigger things to worry about than a guy hiding a few credit cards. I smiled again. I told Brandon he was absolutely right about standard divorces. However, I reminded him that I am an active-duty military intelligence officer with a top-secret security clearance. I explained that when a civilian attempts to use forged medical documents to trigger a false Uniform Code of Military Justice investigation against a cleared officer, the federal government suddenly becomes extremely interested. I told him that attempting to sabotage national security personnel using fraudulent interstate communications elevated his petty domestic theft into a severe federal inquiry. I let that reality sink into the silent room. I told Brandon that I had handed over the wiped hard drive data, the offshore routing numbers, and the proof of the forged clinic letterhead to the Cybercrimes Division 14 days ago. The agents were already building the indictment. And then I delivered the ultimate checkmate regarding his recent legal strategy. I reminded Brandon of the sworn deposition he had attended just 2 weeks prior. I pointed out that he had sat in this exact room, raised his right hand, and sworn under oath that he had no hidden debts, no offshore accounts, and no knowledge of any fraudulent transfers. I informed him that committing perjury in a civil deposition while simultaneously being the target of an active federal wire fraud investigation was akin to locking himself inside a burning building and swallowing the key. Brandon slumped back in his chair, the sheer magnitude of his legal peril crushing him into the leather upholstery. He looked at Jason for help, but his older brother had physically pushed his chair away from the table, desperately trying to create distance from the radioactive fallout. Jason realized that his secret recording of my fake surrender was completely worthless. He had brought his family here to celebrate a victory only to march them directly onto a legal execution block. Diane began to hyperventilate. She clutched her designer handbag, her eyes darting frantically around the room. She began rambling, insisting that they just wanted a fair share of the house, that they just wanted what was best for Leo, and that they could simply tear up the FBI complaint and go back to Jason's original settlement offer. Elias laughed aloud. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the large room. He informed Diane that federal investigations cannot be canceled just because the target suddenly feels bad. The United States government was not a collection agency they could negotiate with over coffee. I leaned back in my chair, projecting absolute dominance. The first phase of my retaliation was complete. I had stripped Brandon of his false confidence, exposed his criminal liability, and trapped his enabling mother in the exact same legal snare. They were terrified, completely paralyzed by the federal threat hanging over their heads. But I was not finished. The wire fraud revelation was merely the opening salvo to shatter their defenses. I had promised myself I was going to burn his entire world to the ground, and I still had 2 massive incendiary charges waiting to be deployed. I glanced at the heavy oak doors of the conference room, knowing that at any second, a very specific guest was scheduled to make her grand entrance and turn this legal nightmare into a spectacular personal apocalypse. The heavy oak doors of the conference room unlatched with a loud, echoing click. Every head at the table snapped toward the entrance. Vanessa walked into the room. She looked absolutely nothing like the carefree, pampered woman I had observed stepping out of the luxury high-rise just days ago. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her face was pale and drawn, and the pronounced curve of her pregnancy was undeniable. She looked terrified, but beneath that terror was a sharp, frantic rage. Trailing closely behind her was a sharply dressed attorney carrying a thick briefcase. Brandon physically recoiled in his leather chair. The last remaining drops of blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. He gripped the armrest so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to deploy another desperate lie, but his voice completely failed him. Vanessa did not hesitate. She marched straight past Jason and Diane, ignoring their confused stares, and stopped directly across from Brandon. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick stack of printed photographs and bank statements, and threw them violently across the mahogany table. The glossy pictures scattered perfectly, landing right on top of Brandon's federal wire fraud dossier. The images displayed exactly what I had requested in my anonymous package. There were photos of Brandon signing the lease for her luxury apartment. There were printed receipts for the diamond tennis bracelet and the designer bags. There were screenshots of text messages where he promised her a lavish future, funded by his massive, entirely fictional investment portfolio. Vanessa's voice shook with unadulterated fury as she pointed a manicured finger at my husband. She screamed that he was a pathological liar and a broke, pathetic fraud. She announced to the entire room that she had received a federal subpoena threatening to name her as a co-conspirator in a wire fraud investigation because of the stolen money he used to pay her rent. She turned to Elias and declared with absolute desperation that she was turning over every single gift, every bank transfer record, and every text message to the legal team. She wanted full immunity. She was throwing Brandon entirely under the bus to save herself from federal prison. Diane stared at the scattered photographs in utter bewilderment. She looked at the pregnant woman standing in the conference room, then looked at her son. Her suburban brain could not process the rapid collapse of her reality. She demanded to know who this hysterical woman was and why she was throwing pictures at her son. I leaned forward and gladly provided the introduction. I told Diane that this was Vanessa, the woman Brandon had been secretly funding with the money he stole from our son's college account. I pointed to Vanessa's prominent stomach and offered Diane my coldest congratulations, informing her that she was about to become a grandmother for the second time, courtesy of her golden boy's downtown mistress. Jason leaped out of his chair, his diplomatic facade completely disintegrating. He shouted at Brandon, demanding to know if any of this was true. He yelled that Brandon had sworn to the entire family that I was the one having an affair. Brandon was cornered. The federal fraud charges sat on his left, his pregnant mistress stood screaming on his right, and his entire family was watching him drown. Like a true narcissist facing absolute destruction, he tried to deflect the blame. He pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that I drove him to it. He claimed my military deployments made him lonely, and my strict financial budgeting made him feel trapped. He actually tried to argue that stealing my money to fund a second family was a natural response to my lack of emotional availability. Vanessa's attorney immediately shut him down, stating for the record that his client was officially cooperating with my legal counsel and severing all ties with Brandon. The attorney advised Brandon to secure federal defense counsel immediately, then firmly guided a sobbing, furious Vanessa out of the conference room. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, sealing my husband inside the tomb he had built for himself. Brandon slumped in his chair, defeated, exposed, and mathematically ruined. But the execution was not over. I had one final catastrophic charge left to detonate. I turned my attention entirely away from my husband and locked eyes with Diane. She was breathing heavily, clutching her handbag to her chest as if it could shield her from the nightmare unfolding around her. Her precious son was a cheating, fraudulent, bankrupt liar. But she still believed she had a safe suburban fortress to retreat to. She still believed she could go home, lock her doors, and complain to her neighborhood friends about how unfair the world was to her family. I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper, printed on official county clerk letterhead. I slid it across the table with a gentle, deliberate push. It glided past the FBI dossier and the scattered photos of designer handbags coming to a rest directly in front of Diane. I kept my voice soft, ensuring every single word cut deep into her manufactured reality. I told Diane that she had cursed me in my own living room over a fake DNA test. I reminded her that she had rallied her bridge club and our neighbors to vandalize my car and destroy my military career. I asked her if she knew what her precious, perfect son had done to secure the cash to feed his mistress and his gambling addiction. Diane stared at the paper, her eyes scanning the bold black text at the top. Notice of default and immediate foreclosure. I watched the exact moment her mind comprehended the numbers printed on the page. I explained the math to her with brutal clarity. I told her that Brandon needed collateral to pump into his offshore margin accounts. Since he could not legally touch my house, he looked for an easier, more trusting target. I informed her that 8 months ago Brandon forged her electronic signature to take out a maximum capacity home equity line of credit on the house she had lived in for 30 years. Jason gasped, rushing it around the table to look over his mother's shoulder at the document. I did not stop talking. I told Diane that Brandon had borrowed over $300,000 against her life savings and lost every single penny of it on the crypto market. I pointed to the default ledger on the page. I explained that he had stopped making the mortgage payments 90 days ago and had been secretly intercepting the bank's warning letters. I leaned closer, delivering the final fatal strike. I told Diane that the bank had officially executed the foreclosure. I informed her that the county sheriff was legally scheduled to arrive at her property at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to physically remove her from the premises and change the locks. She was entirely legally homeless. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the terrifying quiet that follows a massive explosion before the shockwave hits. Diane's hands began to shake violently. The paper fluttered from her grip, landing on the floor. Her knees buckled beneath the table. Jason had to grab her shoulders to keep her from sliding out of her chair. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as a raw, guttural sound tore its way out of her throat. It was not a cry of sadness. It was the sound of a woman realizing her entire identity, her wealth, her home, and her social standing had been incinerated by the son she worshipped. Diane slowly turned her head to look at Brandon. Brandon held up his hands in a pathetic gesture of defense. He stammered, backing his chair away from his mother. He tried to tell her he was going to fix it. He cried out that the market was supposed to rebound, that he just needed a little more time to win the money back, that he never meant for her to lose the house. Diane did not say a word. She surged upward with a sudden violent burst of adrenaline. She lunged across the corner of the mahogany table, raising her hand, and slapped Brandon across the face with every ounce of strength in her body. The crack of her palm against his cheek echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Brandon recoiled, knocking his own chair backward. He stumbled, gripping his reddened face in shock. Diane did not stop. She screamed at him, a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. She hit his chest, sobbing wildly, cursing him for destroying her life, for stealing her home, and for humiliating her in front of everyone. Jason grabbed his mother around the waist, trying to pull her back, but he was yelling at Brandon too. Jason screamed that Brandon was a sociopath, that he had ruined the entire family name, and that he was going to rot in federal prison. Brandon yelled back, blaming Jason for not lending him money when he asked, blaming his mother for raising him with high expectations, and blaming me for not giving him access to my military salary. The pristine, high-powered legal conference room devolved into an absolute bloodbath. The perfect suburban family. The people who had judged me, siliensed me, and tried to strip me of my child and my career were literally tearing each other apart like wild animals. They were screaming, crying, and turning on one another with a viciousness that proved their family loyalty was nothing but a fragile illusion built on convenience and shared arrogance. Elias stood calmly by my side, watching the carnage unfold with professional detachment. He leaned down and quietly asked if I had seen enough. I looked at my husband cowering against the wall as his mother shrieked at him. I looked at the scattered evidence of his fraud, his infidelity, and his absolute moral bankruptcy. The trap had executed flawlessly. I had not just defeated them, I had forced them to destroy themselves. I picked up my briefcase. The execution was over. There was nothing left in this room for me but the ashes of their ruined lives. I nodded to Elias, turned my back on the screaming family, and walked out the heavy oak doors, stepping forward into my absolute freedom. I stepped out into the plush, carpeted hallway, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind me, muffling the chaotic screaming of the family I had just dismantled. The air outside the conference room was cool, quiet, and profoundly peaceful. Elias stepped out a moment later, adjusting his tie with a satisfied expression. He did not say a word, simply gesturing toward the glass elevators at the far end of the corridor. Before we could take more than a few steps, the elevator chime rang sharp and clear. The steel doors slid open and 4 individuals stepped out into the hallway. They were not corporate lawyers or wealthy clients. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across the back. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived precisely on schedule. The lead agent, a tall man with a severe expression and a thick stack of manila folders tucked under his arm, approached Elias. They exchanged a brief professional nod. Elias stepped aside, silently pointing toward the conference room doors we had just exited. I stood my ground in the hallway, crossing my arms over my charcoal suit, and watched as the agents pushed the heavy oak doors open. The sudden intrusion abruptly silenced the violent domestic war raging inside. Diane froze mid-scream. Jason stumbled backward, raising his hands defensively. Brandon, still clutching his reddened cheek where his mother had struck him, stared at the agents with wide, terrified eyes. The heavy glass panels framing the conference room allowed me a perfect, unobstructed view of his absolute destruction. The lead agent did not waste time with pleasantries. His voice carried through the slightly ajar door, sharp and authoritative, ringing with the full weight of the United States government. He announced Brandon's full legal name and stated he was executing a federal arrest warrant. The charges echoed into the hallway: wire fraud, bank fraud, and perjury. Brandon's knees buckled. The arrogant, manipulative predator who had confidently walked into this building expecting to extort half my net worth was entirely gone. In his place was a broken, sobbing coward. Two agents stepped forward, pulling his arms behind his back and securing heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click of the restraints locking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Diane lunged forward, her maternal instincts momentarily overriding her shock. She grabbed the lead agent's sleeve, shrieking that there must be a mistake, that her son was a good man, and that I was the one who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. The agent calmly detached her hand from his jacket. He looked at her with zero sympathy and delivered a devastating verbal strike. He informed Diane that she was formally listed as an unindicted co-conspirator regarding the fraudulent crowdfunding campaign. He advised her to secure independent criminal defense counsel immediately and warned her that interfering with a federal arrest would result in her own immediate incarceration. Diane collapsed back into her chair, utterly paralyzed by the reality of her situation. She covered her face with her trembling hands, finally understanding that her blind loyalty to her golden child had cost her absolutely everything. The agents marched Brandon out of the conference room. As they escorted him down the hallway toward the elevators, he dragged his feet, his head hanging low in absolute disgrace. When he passed by me, he lifted his gaze one last time. His eyes were red and pleading silently, begging for a mercy he had never once shown me. I did not flinch. I did not offer a victorious smirk or a word of anger. I simply stared back at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a military intelligence officer assessing a neutralized threat. I watched the elevator doors close, swallowing my husband and removing him from my life forever. The fallout over the next several weeks was swift, brutal, and entirely predictable. At precisely 8 o'clock the following morning, the county sheriff arrived at Diane's pristine suburban property. The foreclosure eviction was executed without delay. The neighbors who had previously flooded my phone with hateful messages stood on their perfectly manicured lawns and watched in stunned silence as movers hauled Diane's designer furniture out onto the driveway. The bank changed the locks physically, barring her from the fortress of superiority she had guarded for 3 decades. With her bank accounts frozen by federal investigators and her credit completely destroyed by Brandon's fraudulent mortgage, Diane had nowhere to turn. She was forced to sign a lease on a cramped, dilapidated apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was the exact type of impoverished area she had spent her entire life mocking at her country club luncheons. But the loss of her home was only the beginning of her punishment. The federal authorities subpoenaed the crowdfunding platform, tracing every single donation back to its source. When the neighborhood bridge club, the church groups, and her affluent friends realized their money was frozen as evidence in a federal wire fraud investigation, they turned on Diane with vicious ferocity. The women she had weaponized against me demanded their money back. When Diane could not pay, they ostracized her completely. She became a social pariah, shunned by the very community she had tried to manipulate. She was left entirely alone in her squalid apartment, surrounded by the ruins of her fake empire. Jason proved his loyalty was just as transactional as I had predicted. Desperate to save his own middle management career and shield his family from the toxic fallout, he publicly disowned his mother and brother. He refused to answer Diane's desperate phone calls and explicitly banned her from visiting her grandchildren. Their family loyalty, a concept they had loudly preached while trying to destroy me, shattered the second it became personally inconvenient for them. Meanwhile, my own life moved forward with unstoppable momentum. The military investigation into my conduct was officially closed. Major Davis called me back into the briefing room at the Cyber Intelligence Command Center. The atmosphere was no longer hostile. It was filled with deep professional respect. He handed me the formal memorandum restoring my top secret security clearance to its full capacity. The military medical DNA test had definitively proven my innocence, and Brandon's subsequent federal indictment for forgery and fraud entirely cleared my name. Major Davis shook my hand, commending my composure and tactical brilliance under extreme psychological pressure. I walked out of his office wearing my uniform with immense pride, knowing I had defended my honor and my country with equal ferocity. The civilian family court proceedings were remarkably brief. With Brandon sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting trial for multiple felonies, he defaulted on all divorce proceedings. The judge granted my petition in full. I retained 100% equity in my home, my military pension, and my savings. Most importantly, I was awarded sole legal and physical custody of Leo. Brandon's parental rights were systematically dismantled, ensuring he could never use the family court system to harass my son again. 6 months later, I sat in the warm, sunlit living room of the home I had fought so fiercely to protect. The aroma of a home-cooked meal drifted from the kitchen. The sounds of Leo giggling happily as he stacked wooden blocks on the rug filled the space with pure, unadulterated joy. The house was safe. The perimeter was secure. The enemies who had tried to invade this sanctuary were gone, locked away in prison cells and isolated slums. I opened my laptop and reviewed the final legal charters for my newest mission. Surviving Brandon's calculated ambush had revealed a massive vulnerability in the system. Too many female service members faced similar economic and emotional abuse from civilian spouses who believed military deployments made their wives easy targets. They weaponized the uniform code of military justice, threatened security clearances, and used financial manipulation to trap women who were actively serving their country. I took the substantial settlement funds I had secured from the defamation lawsuits against Diane's neighborhood enablers and matched it with my own savings. I established a specialized legal defense foundation. The organization partnered with aggressive civilian attorneys like Elias and former military JAG officers to provide elite pro bono legal representation for active duty women facing high conflict divorces and financial abuse. I was going to ensure that no female soldier, sailor, airman, or marine would ever have to face a predatory spouse without a legal shark standing by her side. I closed my laptop and stepped away from the desk. I walked over to the rug and scooped Leo into my arms. He wrapped his small hands around my neck and rested his head on my shoulder, entirely safe, entirely loved. I looked out the large bay window at the quiet suburban street. I had faced the absolute worst of human betrayal. I had watched the man I loved attempt to sell my future to fund a secret life. I had watched his family gather like vultures to pick my bones clean. They had expected a victim. They had expected a woman who would bow her head, surrender her assets, and walk away in shame. They forgot they were dealing with a woman forged by military discipline. I learned the most valuable lesson a person can ever master. Your worth is not determined by the people who betray you. Your value is not defined by the lies whispered behind your back. True power does not come from screaming the loudest or manipulating the weak. True power is the quiet, unbreakable resolve to establish a boundary and defend it with lethal precision. If you ever find yourself surrounded by people who demand your silence, who belittle your achievements, or who attempt to strip you of your dignity, do not yield. Gather your data. Secure your position. Let them underestimate you. And when the time is right, execute your defense so flawlessly that they never dare to cross your path again. Stand tall in your truth, protect what is yours, and never ever apologize for burning down the cages they try to build around you.